Australia. Kita berikan aplaus kepada beliau. Ya. Ya. Jadi menyampaikan salam dari Bapak Dekan Fakultas Hukum Tas Jember. Terima kasih atas kehadirannya dan selamat datang. Mungkin kalau di Fakultas Hukum baru kali ini ya Pak Tommy ya beliau hadir ya. Tapi mungkin kalau di Untas Jember mungkin sudah sebelumnya. Kemudian saya ingin menyapa juga Bapak Dr. Gautama Budi Arundati SH.MH selaku Ketua Bagian Ilmu Hukum Fakultas Hukum Universitas Jember. Kemudian jadi beliau selaku Ketua Bagian di Ilmu Hukum. Kemudian Pak Al-Khonif SH.MH, ini terhalang oleh layar ya. PSD ya, selaku dosen Fakultas Hukum Tas Jember. Juga di sini ada Pak Rian Adivira Prabowo selaku dosen Fakultas Hukum Jember yang nantinya akan bertindak selaku moderator atau pemandu acara internasional public lecture. Di sini saya juga lihat ada Pak Kristo, namanya panjang gitu. Pokoknya ada sagalanya ya Pak Kristo ya. Ini selamat Pak Kristo bahwa UKM IMPA Akasia di bawah bimbingan atau di bawah pendampingan beliau telah lolos pendanaan program penguatan kapasitas Ormawa. Jadi kita berikan aplaus untuk tim IMPA Akasia. Tapi saya tadi menyampaikan Pak Tommy ke Pak Kristo, kata orang Jawa, ojo enak-enakan mas. Karena 6 bulan ke depan tuh Pak Kristo harus effort selaku pendamping. Tetapi nanti itu ada anugerah atau medals atau medali yang diberikan kepada pendamping yang mempunyai prestasi dengan kriteria tertentu. Kemudian saya juga ingin menyapa seluruh rekan-rekan mahasiswa sebagai peserta IPL siang hari ini. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan untuk kita semua. Tentunya rasa puji syukur tetap patut kita panjatkan kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa taala, Tuhan yang Maha Esa, karena atas limpahan rahmat dan hidayahnya kita sekalian dapat menghadiri acara International Public Lecture ke-10 dengan tema Theories of Power and Policy Making. Sebagaimana kita ketahui bahwa program IPL ini diinisiasi, digagas, dan dijalankan oleh UNEJ sebagai program resmi, ya, sebagai wadah untuk memberikan akses bagi mahasiswa di dalam menjajaki pengetahuan yang lebih luas, dan kemudian diharapkan dapat memberikan wawasan dengan menghadirkan pemateri-pemateri yang tidak hanya pada skup nasional tetapi pada skup internasional. IPL ke-10 ini nantinya akan diisi oleh pemateri utama yakni Ibu Elizabeth Kramer yang tentunya kompetensi, pengetahuan dan pengalaman beliau tidak perlu diragukan lagi. Jadi terima kasih Ibu Elizabeth Kramer sekali lagi. Baik. Mungkin kalau kita ingat pada IPL yang 9 kali sebelumnya dilaksanakan, itu Pak Rian kalau nggak salah opening remarks-nya disampaikan dalam bentuk bahasa Inggris ya. Tetapi ini ya sesekali dalam bahasa Indonesia tidak apa-apa, karena Ibu Elizabeth perlu kita ketahui bahwa seingat kami berdasarkan data dari UNESCO itu bahasa Indonesia itu merupakan salah satu bahasa internasional ya Pak Al-Khonif ya, kalau tidak salah demikian. Ini dari bahasa resmi begitu ya di sidang umum UNESCO begitu ya. Lah sehingga kami coba ini di sesi ini menggunakan dalam bahasa Indonesia. Oleh karenanya kami mengajak seluruh rekan-rekan mahasiswa ya untuk dengan serius dan seksama serta nanti harapannya mengikuti sampai dengan acara ini berakhir. Akhirnya sebelum menutup sambutan ini Mohon perkenan sekali lagi terima kasih Ibu Elizabeth Kramer, terima kasih Bapak Ketua Bagian, kepada Pak Al-Khonif, Pak Rian, dan teman-teman di tim IPL yang telah menginisiasi dan menyelenggarakan acara ini. Karena sekaligus diminta membuka dengan mengucap Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, International Public Lecture ke-10 dengan tema Theories of Power and Policy Making dinyatakan dengan resmi dibuka. Demikian prakata singkat dari kami. Wabillahi taufik walhidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan untuk kita semuanya.
To 30 minutes. Wow, okay. Saya kira tadi ada 1 jam.
Oh ya, kenapa di
Okay. Kalau PowerPoint-nya?
Ya, Mas.
Okay. Okay. Okay, sebelumnya saya ingin mengucapkan terima kasih atas kesempatan ini untuk memberikan kuliah tamu hari ini. Terima kasih kepada teman-teman dari Fakultas Hukum dan terutama kepada Dr. Al-Khanif dari CHRM 2 yang mengundang saya untuk memberikan kuliah ini. Nah, sebetulnya saya akan mempresentasi dalam bahasa Inggris, tetapi mungkin campur aja ya. Kalau ada yang mungkin bisa disampaikan dalam bahasa Indonesia, saya akan coba. Okay, next slide please. So, aku harus lihat dari sini karena susah untuk gitu. Okay, jadi tema untuk presentasi ini adalah Power and Ideology in Policy Making, yaitu kekuasaan dan ideologi dalam pembentukan kebijakan, khususnya kebijakan pemerintah. Tapi sebelumnya, kalau konsep kekuasaan itu, the concept of power, ada banyak pertanyaan sebelum kita melihat konsep ini memang apa. So we need to look at what is the definition. Does the definition change depending on the situation, or do we have a consistent definition always for power? How do we measure power? Bagaimana kita bisa mengukur kekuasaan itu sebesar apa? What evidence can we look at to see how much power somebody has or how much power an organization has? What makes some people powerful and some people powerless? Yeah, there's usually a relationship, and within that relationship, it's very rare that power will be equal. Biasanya ada yang punya lebih banyak kekuasaan dan ada yang punya lebih kurang kekuasaan. What kinds of responsibilities do people who are powerful have? That's the government for this lecture, right? What is the government's responsibility to citizens? And how should they use their power? And how does power and ideology shape policy? Next slide. Okay, sebelumnya ada 2 konsep yang sangat penting ya, if we're going to talk about power. Mungkin kalian sudah pernah dengar atau membaca atau menggunakan teori ini dalam tulisan Anda sendiri atau research Anda sendiri. But these are 2 very, very important concepts in sociology. And in law as well, I guess. So we have structures and agency. Ada yang sudah pernah dengar konsep ini? Belum? Okay. Okay, mulai dari dasarnya aja ya. So structures are the context around us, the environment around us that gives us the rules for how we live our life. Structures can be formal. Jadi kalau ada undang-undang, ada kebijakan dari pemerintah, itu termasuk struktur yang formal. Ya, kalau melanggarkan undang-undang itu pasti akan ada sanksi. So those are formal rules that guide what we can and can't do. Tapi ada juga yang tidak formal, informal. Misalnya agama. Agama kan ada syaratnya, tapi itu bukan undang-undang. But we follow them anyway because we believe in the religion, or we are part of a community that expects us to behave in a certain way. So religion is one kind of informal rules. Mungkin juga keluarga. Your family might have some informal rules for you as well, right? Sebagai hubungan antara anak dan orang tua itu pasti nggak seimbang ya. So your parents have expectations of you as their child, and this is part of the structural environment that you live your life. If your parents say you can do something, then you have permission to do it. If they say, no, you can't do that, you have to make a decision. Are you going to do it anyway? If you do it anyway, maybe there's going to be consequences. Or do you follow what your parents say? Yeah, so these are the kinds of informal structures that guide our decisions. Now, the ability to make decisions, kemampuan untuk mengambil keputusan itu, we call that agency. So agency is what power do I have to do whatever I want, whenever I want. If I have 100% autonomy, today if I want, I can just walk out of this lecture, get on a plane, go to Australia, no problems, then I have 100% agency. But in a society, it's usually not possible for people to have 100% agency because the structures around us limit what we can and can't do. Also, in a society, if people have 100% agency, that means that there's going to be chaos, right? If people do whatever they want all the time, then what happens to society? It's chaos, it's anarchy. So these are the concepts that we use in sociology to talk about power. Next slide. Okay, so we can think about some examples maybe, yeah? Ada contohnya di sebelah slide-nya. What kinds of structures, I can't read it from here. Apa yang mempengaruhi pekerjaan yang Anda akan dapat setelah lulus dari universitas? So, for example, aku anak Fakultas Hukum, S1 saya dalam hukum. Nggak mungkin saya dapat pekerjaan sebagai dokter di rumah sakit, ya. The structures of society are that if you want to become a doctor, you have to have the right qualifications. If you don't have the right qualifications, you can't be a doctor. So my agency is, maybe I'm a law student, but I want to become a doctor. I can't because of the structural constraints. Now, what's another example? Lulus dari Fakultas Hukum lagi. Teman dari orang tua saya punya law firm, law office, yang cukup terkenal. My father is friends with that man, and so it's easier for me to get a job there because they know each other. We have social capital, we have a social relationship. Jadi struktur informal itu sebagai teman keluarga atau dalam komunitas itu memperlancarkan aku untuk mendapat pekerjaan seperti itu. So these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. when we talk about structure and agency. Next slide. Okay, so moving on to power. Now, these are some definitions from very well-known textbooks, articles. You can see, I'm just going to read through them. They're quite similar. Power is the ability to achieve a desired outcome. Jadi, abilitas untuk mencapai outcome yang kamu mau. And usually it's the power to do something. Yeah, there's an action involved. The second one, power concerns the ability of individuals and groups to further their own interests via the capacity to exert control and influence. So the first definition is quite general. The second one is talking about groups and influences. Next slide. So those are very general definisi yang tadi itu sangat umumnya. Tapi kalau khususnya kalau dalam bahasa Inggris, if we're speaking about academic English, there's actually some different language that we use when we're talking about power. Power is very complicated concept, but we have some words to describe different aspects of power that you can see here. So you have power, which is compliance with overt or tacit threats. Jadi kalau dalam, ya contohnya, saya melakukan apa yang Jasper mau karena saya takut. Konsekuensinya apa kalau aku nggak lakukan itu? So that's power. Influence is a little bit different, right? Influence is, mungkin aku sangat I'm very impressed by Jasper. I think he's a really good researcher. I admire him. He asks me to do something, and so I do it because I want to please him. I want him to be happy, so he has an influence over me. Manipulation is a little bit different. Say I want to go to lunch with my friend, and I want nasi goreng, but my friend wants sate kambing. And my friend says, ada resto yang baru itu yang ada sate kambing yang enak banget ya. And I say to my friend, aku dengar kok kalau hari Senin restorannya tutup. Even though I know that's not true. Aku bohong. Tapi teman itu pikir, oh ya kalau tutup, oke, nasi goreng aja. So I've manipulated my friend, yeah? I lied to my friend to tell them, to convince them to make the decision that I want them to make. Force, that's more obvious, yeah? Like, that's something that you would see maybe in a war situation, like using military forces to make people do what you want, using threats, maybe if the police come with their guns and say, kamu harus melakukan ini. Yeah, of course you're going to do it because you don't want to be shot. So that's force. And then authority is similar to the example that I made before. If somebody is above me in the hierarchy, my understanding is that I should follow what they say. It's not about whether I agree or not. I trust that the person who's my boss, if they ask me to do it, it must be reasonable. And so I do it. So that's the authority in power, yeah? Jadi ada perbedaan yang kecil antara kata-katanya, but they all feed into this concept of power. Next slide. Okay. Still on power. So this is a very famous definition of power, which was probably maybe in academia, in the Western academia, particularly in the US and the UK and Europe, was prevalent until maybe the 1960s, 1970s. But I think it's good to look at it because this is I think, the very normative definition of power that most people have today. So power is a relationship. For there to be power, there must be two people. If you're by yourself, there's no concept of power, because power is about getting somebody else to do something that you want them to do. So therefore, power is individual and it's behavioral. Power is about domination. It's about making somebody do something, or persuading somebody to do something, or influencing them to do something that benefits you. And this is probably the most interesting concept within power. So power is seen as a zero-sum game. Maksudnya apa? Kalau saya punya kekuasaan, artinya kamu nggak punya. If my power goes down, your power must go up. If we have a relationship where the power dynamic is changing, it must always equal one. That's the basis of this previous normative definition of power. Nah, kalau membaca definisi ini, apakah Anda bisa lihat kelemahan dalam definisi ini? Mungkin ada yang mau sharing? No?
Is there any chance where two powers share common power?
Exactly. I'm sure you can think of a situation where an outcome is mutually beneficial. Ya, where dua sisinya bisa menang dari situasi itu. So in this definition of power, there's no room for that. Somebody must win and somebody must lose. Somebody must have power, somebody must not have power. But of course, there would be situations where you can compromise, you can have two people who maybe in one instance have a particular dynamic, and then in another situation they have a different dynamic, yeah? Here the definition of power is quite static. But in reality, power is very dynamic. If you think about a husband and a wife, in some situations, maybe the husband has power, and in other situations, maybe the wife has power. The relationship dynamic changes depending on the context, depending on the situation. In this definition, there's no nuance like that. Ada lagi? Okay, gak apa-apa. Lanjut aja. So, one of the most famous critiques of this definition is by an academic called Stephen Lukes. If you want to read about power and concepts of power and definitions of power, this book, Power: Radical View, is probably the most famous text still to this day. It's several editions in. And so Lukes, he was from the UK. I can't remember which university. Aku lupa dia dari universitas yang mana. Tapi dia baca definisi seperti yang tadi. Dan dia pikir, kayaknya ini enggak menangkap konsep kekuasaan secara komplit. So he wrote this book, and he came up with 3 dimensions of power. 2 slides. Yeah, okay. So the first concept, or the first dimension of power, is like that previous definition. It's very straightforward, it's not dynamic. Somebody has power and somebody doesn't have power. It's like that. So one-dimensional examples of power are like police arrests, military campaigns. Sometimes they're not violent, sometimes they can be things like elections, pemilu. Jadi kalau dari pemilu itu ada konflik kan antara partai politik, antara calon presiden gitu. So we can see the conflict. It's not physical, but it's dalam wacana, dalam apa ya, interview bisa lihat memang ada konflik ya, because they want to convince you that they're the best option. And we can see the outcome of the conflict through the results of the election. So it's observable, we can see it. But for Luke's, there are other dimensions of power as well that we have to think about. Yang kedua itu, he calls it agenda setting. It's not so easy to explain, but agenda setting is about which stakeholders have the power to put forward the agenda. Contohnya gini, mungkin ada apa ya, lobbyists dari industri pertambangan, mining industry lobbyists, dan mereka pergi ke DPR dan bilang, oh untuk membantu industri kita, mohon bikin undang-undang seperti ini. And they have connections with the politicians, maybe they donated to the political parties, so they have the power to create the agenda. Now, in that situation, who doesn't have the power? Orang yang tinggal di desa, yang mungkin akan apa ya, merasakan dampaknya dari industri tambangan itu. They don't have the power to go to Jakarta. They don't have the connections with the politicians. So they don't have the power to set the agenda. And that is what shapes discourses. So when we look at apa undang-undang yang lolos di DPR itu, there are thousands of issues that could be regulated by the parliament. Thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. But why do they choose the specific laws that they do? Because somebody is setting the agenda. Political parties, politicians, the president, business interests. Who's not usually setting the agenda? Ordinary people. People who are disadvantaged, people who are poor, people who are from minorities. And so within the policy-making sphere, there's already a power imbalance, because the concerns and the issues that are faced by people who are at the bottom of the social chain are not going up to the parliament. And if they are, it's because of a lot of energy and power and lobbying. It's not because they have money, it's not because they have connections. So that's agenda setting. So that's a different kind of power. Yang ketiga itu kekuasaan sebagai apa ya, value shaping. I don't know how to say that in Indonesian. Membentukkan nilai gitu. Membentukkan nilai. Okay, this is even more difficult to explain because usually it's very subtle. It's not obvious and it's not overt. So one example, I have a few examples, is about norma-norma yang terkait dengan gender. So from when you're very small, you're looking around society and you're seeing, oh kalau perempuan perilakunya seperti itu. Oh kalau laki-laki aktivitas yang terkait dengan laki-laki itu seperti itu. So as a child you're observing, this is what women do, this is what men do. Mungkin juga ada tambahan dari agama. Your religion has specific roles for women, specific roles for men. Mungkin juga ada dari komunitas atau from your parents or from your family or whatever. Sehingga pada waktu Anda sudah dewasa, kamu nggak memikirkan perilaku aktivitas perempuan itu seperti apa. You just know. You already have the concept of what a woman is, the concept of what a man is, and you don't question it because you've been learning it since you were really young. So that's value shaping power. Nah, okay, untuk lihat perbedaan antara tiganya ya. Contohnya begini. Ada anak yang kecil. No. Anak yang mau kuliah. Sudah lulus SMA, nilainya cukup bagus. First dimension of power, orang tuanya bilang kepada anaknya, kamu harus menjadi dokter. Kalau tidak, we're not going to pay, kami nggak akan membiayakan kuliah kamu. That's direct force, not physical, but direct force, threat. If you don't do this, akan ada konsekuensi yang buruk untuk kamu. That's the first dimension of power. It's direct, observable. Now, second dimension of power, your parents say, orang tua bilang, okay nak, nilainya cukup bagus, kamu bisa pilih, mau jadi dokter atau mau jadi insinyur. Okay. You have an option, you have two choices, but the agenda is set. Your parents have set the agenda for you. You have some choice, but ya kasihan kalau mau ikut mau belajar sastra atau hukum, ya nggak boleh. So that's the second type of power, agenda setting. You still have a choice, but it's limited. Nah, kalau yang ketiga itu, sejak kamu kecil, setiap kali orang tua kamu lihat dokter, they say things like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if you were a doctor? Doctors are such good people. Oh, look at them, they're helping people all the time. Isn't that great? That's so great. And then maybe one day when you're young, you go to the hospital, sakit perut atau apa, and you get treated by the doctor, and after the treatment, your parents say, that doctor was so nice. Wouldn't it be nice if you were a doctor too? That would be nice. That would be nice. Yeah? Enggak pernah bilang, kamu harus. Enggak pernah bilang, ada dua pilihan. It's just in your brain. And then when you finish high school and you have to choose what degree you want to do, you choose doctor. Because from when you were young, your parents have shaped your thinking, they've shaped your values to think, oh, that would be a great job. That would be a really great job. But there's no force. Your parents don't even say to you. Your parents say, oh, you can do whatever you want. But the idea is already there, the value is there. So that is the power. So, okay, itu contoh yang mungkin agak obvious ya. Tapi kita bisa lihat kalau yang ketiga itu, that comes in so many different formats. It can come as propaganda. It can come as discourse, like different types of discourse. It can come through the media. Can come through all of these different forces. Like even social media now, you're just watching influencers on TikTok or whatever, and what they're saying is just going into your mind, and maybe you're not even conscious about it. But they have a power over you. There's a power in that, and that's why influencers get paid a lot of money, because they have this ability to shape your values. Next slide. Okay, mungkin skip aja ya. So this is just a table which outlines the different dimensions. Next slide. and a diagram, same concept. Next slide. Okay. So how does this enter into the political context? Where are my notes? Okay. So this is a bit, I don't know, formal, right? This this diagram. But we can see here that you have structures. So if we're talking about government, if we're talking about policy making, you have structures at the international level, international agreements. You have structures at the national level, which are your political institutions, DPR, President, Kementerian are there. And then you have cultural models and cleavage structures, which is a bit complicated to explain, but cleavage structures are about things like church and state, rural and urban, different kinds of geographies that can influence the context. And then you have political actors and the way that they interact. So this is not directly related to power, but it shows you how the structures and the actors can interact. And it also gives you some sense of the dynamics of that relationship. I think maybe it's not enough time to talk more about that. Next slide. Okay, and then this is what I would call an idealized diagram of the policy cycle. So this is not in reality maybe what happens, but tapi secara teoris kalau mau bikin kebijakan prosesnya bisa seperti ini atau seharusnya seperti ini. So even within the policy cycle, you can see the first step is problem definition and agenda setting. From the very beginning, there's already a power relationship there. Then you go to constructing the policy alternatives or solutions. Ada dana untuk implementasinya. Cukup seringnya. And that's because the people who are making decisions about the budget allocation have the power, but they choose not to prioritize that. They have the power to prioritize different things. Kalau aku lihat, kalau penelitian saya tentang industri tembakau, kalau lihat apa ya, peraturan yang terkait dengan iklan, they're quite strict. Tapi implementasinya cukup jelek kalau saya lihat ya. So, and it's because there's no budget and there's no commitment. So there's a power dynamic there again. Next slide. Okay, so I said that this would be about power and ideology. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about ideology. Semoga waktunya cukup. But ya mungkin kamu sudah ada apa ya, sudah tahu konsepnya ideologi ya. So ideology is not such a strange concept. It's about how you view the world, how you think the world should work, and how to process change. So depending on your ideology, you will have a different concept of how to get from A to B. I'll explain more in a moment. Next slide. Back one. Yeah, thank you. So your ideology affects your assumptions, your values, and how you understand the world. A lot of people, hopefully not you, but a lot of people don't question ideology. They think that because they believe something because it is true. They believe that there is an objective truth, and that means that the ideology is very difficult to change. But it's invisible, right? Like ideology is not, I can't give you an ideology. It's something that you believe in your head, maybe your heart, maybe your stomach, right? But it's a way of thinking about the world, and it's a way for governments to think about how they make policies, how they govern people. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about ideology within the democratic sense. Yeah, of course, there's lots of different political ideas or types of governments, authoritarian governments. Indonesia punya pengalaman dengan itu juga. There's communism, there's semi-authoritarian states, ada banyak ya, but I'm going to talk about democracy. Indonesia is nominally a democracy. Australia is also nominally a democracy. We call ourselves a democracy, walaupun mungkin ada kekurangan juga di situ. But democracy itself is, in its purest form, the rule of the people, power of the people. It comes from the Greek, demos and kratos, although I should note that in ancient Greece it was actually not really a democracy because only men and only people who owned land could vote. So women and people who didn't have land weren't allowed to vote. So the Greeks came up with the concept, but it was not fulfilled to its maximum there. But now we have, I guess, what most democratic states call a representative democracy. So that means that we as citizens, sebagai WNI Indonesia, we can vote. Kalau ada pemilu, kita bisa masuk suara. Suara itu dihitung, dan yang menang itu menjadi anggota DPR atau presiden atau apa ya. So within the democracy we have a voice. It's not a big voice, but if enough people choose the same person, then you have power in numbers. So that's the rule of the people. Next slide. So within democracy in the Western tradition, there are three key ideologies. Ada tiga ideologi yang mungkin paling terlihat dalam kebijakan. So you have conservatism, liberalism, and socialism as the three concepts, right? These are very big ideas, and they're intellectual ideas. So I think as individuals, sometimes we have some socialist ideas, some conservative ideas, some liberal ideas. Most people are not just one thing. We have lots of different ideas. But there's, I guess, with each of these ideologies, there's a specific worldview of how things should work and how the government should conduct itself. And then I just have political parties at the bottom. So usually political parties, partai politik itu biasanya ada kaitan dengan salah satu ideologi. But it's not really pure. I think it would be very difficult to find a political party that is purely socialist, purely conservative, purely liberal. Biasanya ada campuran juga di situ. But political parties can become like a mascot for different ideologies. Like if you look at the US, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, I guess for social conservatism, people think of the Republican Party. Trump is a social conservative, kind of, or he pretends to be at least. And the Democratic Party is associated with more liberal freedoms. Yeah, so there's like a dichotomy like that. Mungkin di Indonesia ada juga ada partai-partai yang mungkin kalau dilihat oleh populasi dianggap sebagai lebih konservatif, lebih nasionalis, lebih keagamaan atau apa ya. So you have lots of different types of ideologies within the political parties. And usually with elections, that's how certain ideologies become prominent. So it's kind of a reflection on citizens as voters, but also very complicated. Next slide. Okay, what do they mean? Conservatism. Okay, so theoretically, ini secara teoris ya, conservatives view humans as imperfect. Jadi dalam teori ini atau ideologi ini, semua manusia dianggap sebagai tidak sempurna. Jadi peran pemerintah itu untuk mengatur society supaya tidak ada masalah. Yeah, so the government is supposed to protect us, to enforce law and order, manage the economy. So there are some particular policy stances here, like welfare paternalism. So kalau dilihat dari undang-undang, maksudnya ada banyak undang-undang yang mengatur kehidupan kita sehari-hari. So laws about marriage, laws about public decency, laws about many different things, right? For a conservative government, this is really important. We need to have laws that tell people what they can and can't do every day. They also are interventionist in the economy. So they don't think that the economy should be free market. They think that the economy should be managed, and it's the government's responsibility to make sure that the economy is benefiting citizens. So that's conservatism. There are different values. They value hierarchy and authority. They value morality, religion, family values. And they think that if people have too many individual freedoms, then that's a threat to society. So they need to manage and make sure that everybody has the same values. That's kind of the underlying ideology of conservatism. Next slide. So liberalism is the next one. It's more related to freedoms. So, where are my notes? Lost my slide, okay. So the idea of liberty or individual freedoms. So you can have negative or positive freedoms. Negative freedoms means that there's no rules. Positive freedom means there are rules that explicitly allow you to do something. So for example, if I want to wear black clothes, all black clothes, negative freedom is there's no rules that say that I can't wear black clothes. There's no rules at all. That's negative freedom. Positive freedom is there is a rule that says everybody can wear whatever color they want any day, and they're free to do that. So if there's a rule like that, that means that I have a positive freedom. I can wear black, and I know that I'm protected by the law because the law says you can wear whatever color you want. It's the same with human rights, yeah? If you have an absence of laws, you can do whatever you want, but there's always a risk that the laws will change or that there'll be another interpretation that might stop you from being able to do what you want to do. If you have a law that says semua orang di Indonesia punya kebebasan untuk memakai baju dengan warna apapun. If you have that law, that means that you're all free to wear whatever you want and you don't have to worry about the law being changed. That's positive freedom. There's also, I guess, the sense that justice and equality are related to opportunity, not outcome. Ini mungkin bisa dilihat dengan penyandang disabilitas, ya. So when you're looking at people with disability, it's not about the outcome because, ya jelas kalau ada orang yang pakai kursi roda, there's no technology that can get them from here to here. It's not possible, right, if you're using a wheelchair. But what is possible is to have the opportunity. So if you make a ramp, then they have the opportunity to come up and they can get up here. So it's not about the end product, it's about helping people to get to the final stage. And then also within liberalism, they have limited government theory, particularly with market, so they're much more enggak campur tangan dengan industry atau what companies do. There's a sense that capitalism will even out the market and the government doesn't need to do anything because the market will influence pricing and all of these other things. So in Australia, we're considered a liberal democracy. So we have democratic systems, but it's kind of following this ideology. Next slide. The final one is socialism. So socialism is, within ideologies, kind of a response to liberalism. It's a critique of capitalism. So within socialism, the core values are that the community is more important than the individual. There's an equality of outcomes. Class and collective interests need to be taken care of. And that property and ownership is primarily managed by the state or publicly for the best interests of citizens. And a lot of countries have socialist policies, even if they're not socialist governments or they don't call themselves socialist governments. So things like BPJS or free education or cheap transportation, cheap public transportation. These are sort of socialist policies which can exist in liberal or even conservative societies. So there's often a mix. Okay. I feel like I'm talking too much. Do I still have time? 5 minutes? Okay, maybe like 3 slides. Oh yes, that one. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So going back to the question of policy making, what is the role of ideology and power here? So I've already talked about how ideology is linked to power. It's usually in a democracy through elections. Who you choose, which party you choose, will guide whichever party or president wins the election. Usually their ideology will be dominant in policy making. But the basic questions about policy making are still related to ideology, regardless of who wins the election. So there are 2 key questions. The first one is, how much should the government intervene in the market? Jadi, apa ya dalam bahasa Indonesia? Sejauh apa pemerintah harus ikut campur tangan dalam market, industry, atau pasar? Yeah, so that's the first question. The second question is, how much should the government intervene in the lives of citizens, in your lives? How much should the government control what you can and can't do? So those are the 2 key questions for policy making. And what your ideology is will shape if you think a government is good or not. Because if I'm a conservative and there's a liberal government, and the liberal government says, you know what, I don't think that we need to worry about religion anymore. We're gonna, kalau di KTP itu, kita akan menghapus agama. We don't need to know what people's religion are. If I'm a conservative, I'm like, huh? Of course we need to have a religion. People must have a religion. That's really important. Kan sudah berapa tahun begitu? Sudah puluhan tahun. Kenapa mengubah kebijakannya? Why would you change it? I don't understand. So from a conservative ideology or conservative perspective, you would think, oh, that's a bad policy. That's a bad policy. But if you're a liberal and you see, oh, the government mau menghapus agama di KTP, ya pasti setuju. Yeah, why is it important for the government to know what religion I have? I don't care. Kalau tetanggaku agama apapun, who cares? Itu urusan dia. So, and I will think, oh, that's a good policy, yeah? Aku setuju. So within society, there's going to be different perspectives about the policies depending on what your ideology is. And the government too will make decisions based on what their ideology is. So that's kind of, I guess, the main point. We got there in the end. Mungkin ke slide yang terakhir aja ya. Oh no, yang sebelum ini. Yeah, okay. So there's lots of questions that we can ask. Mungkin kita bisa selesai di sini. Ideology is central to all policy making, and the power behind ideology comes from who is in government. So we can ask lots of different questions about how the government should become involved. Like, what do we think as citizens is important? Do we think that the government should be more active in controlling what we can and can't do? Or do we think, probably more accurately, the government should be more active in controlling what other people do? Other people that I don't agree with? Should the government be responsible for certain things? Like, should the government be responsible for the environment, for protecting the environment? From a liberal ideology, if you're purely liberal, then you would probably think, no, the market will demand, the market will control that. If people don't want products that are bad for the environment, they won't buy them. And then there'll be no market, and then the market will sort it out. I mean, that's probably a fantasy, but if you're thinking from a purely ideological perspective, it's like that, right? Also with pricing, if you have competition, mungkin apa contohnya? Kompetisi untuk layanan HP. Like, so you have apa ya? Telkomsel, apa lagi? Indosat, blah 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 blah. From a liberal perspective, the competition here will regulate the market, right? So people are always looking for a cheaper deal, and the companies will compete with each other, and then the prices will go down. That's the theory. Jadi kalau sistemnya seperti itu, sebetulnya pemerintah nggak usah ikut campur. The government should just let it go. But if you're a conservative or a socialist, maybe you think, oh no, seharusnya pemerintah itu membuat kebijakan karena siapa tahu ya nanti kalau harganya naik, orang yang miskin nggak mampu untuk beli pulsa atau apa. So it depends on your perspective. Some people will think the government should do one thing, other people will think the government should do other things. And then there's all kinds of other examples that we can talk about later if you want, to do with discrimination, to do with social support, indigenous heritage, all kinds of issues. Like, what do you think the government should do? Okay, mungkin selesai di situ ya. Terima kasih. Kalau ada pertanyaan boleh dalam bahasa Indonesia. Atau kalau tidak, if there's no questions, that's fine too.
I have two. I have two questions. Actually I have so many, but I resume many questions in my mind in between.
Okay.
The first is about Pancasila as a living entity,
Mhm.
as an outsider.
Yep.
Do you believe that Pancasila is still alive, or it is academic freedom?
I mean, do you believe it's alive?
Yeah. Do you believe that Pancasila is still alive, or is it just a copying? Pancasila is copying, only copying some values from Western perspective, and also socialism or communism
Waduh.
perspective. It is like a true observation, yeah, from your point of view. And the second one is, you said that there are many lobbies in parliament,
Mhm.
which result in the enactment of some laws, which we cannot reach the process of the lobby in the parliament. So, what what can we do as a masyarakat umum
Oh gosh.
to access this?
Okay.
I don't know, maybe to
I definitely have an answer for the second question. For the first question, I'm still thinking.
Let me add one more.
yeah. Okay.
Since, based on your definition, so it implies that since power is everywhere, the resistance is also everywhere. So I would like to know your elaboration on the aspect of what kind of power play can be conducted by the most marginalized or most strategic communities, like for example the minority sexual orientation,
Yeah.
like
Okay.
disability,
Yeah.
and so on.
Okay. Mulai di situ ya. It's a very pertanyaan yang cukup sulit juga ya. Okay. Oh, can I answer? Nanti aku lupa. I'll forget. Can I answer those questions first? Okay, for Pancasila, I think that Pancasila is actually not one ideology. I think it's many, many different ideologies. And so when people say, oh, ideologi Pancasila seperti ini, it's like, yeah, but what aspect of Pancasila are you talking about? Because even within the Pancasila, I think there's conflict, right? Because you have social harmony, and then you have religion. What if there are religions that are in contrast to social harmony? Bisa juga kan? Like you can have some religions that are very, they're very didactic. They say you must do this, this, and this, and if people don't follow, then there's like conflict or punishment or something. So even within the Pancasila, I think there's conflict in itself. So it depends why you're talking about Pancasila and what you're hoping to achieve with it. Because Pancasila in and of itself is a unifying factor for Indonesians, generally speaking, right? Like, I think it wouldn't be normal to find somebody who publicly disagrees with Pancasila. But the way that it gets mobilized sometimes, I think, is probably the issue. And I mean, like, mungkin bukan sekarang ya, tapi kalau lihat zaman Soeharto, the way that Pancasila was mobilized against communist ideals or against subversive activities, whatever that means. Um, I mean, if you look at Panchasila itself, like there are freedoms within that, but the way that the Suharto government was enacting and using Panchasila was very specific and targeted. So I think as an ideology, we have to think about it as multiple ideologies, and I think it means different things to different people. And the interesting power relation is how is the discourse of Panchasila used by specific actors to get what they want? Like, how is it used to silence dissent? Or how is it used to justify certain actions which maybe are not in the best interests of everybody in Indonesia? So I think that's maybe, I don't know, a discussion that we need to have. I'm not an expert on Panchasila. What was the next? Oh, what can people do? Okay, I have an answer for this because I think about this a lot. Kalau disertasi S3 saya tentang korupsi di Indonesia. Dan ini pertanyaan yang sangat umum, sangat biasa dalam kajian anti korupsi. Like, what can we do to stop corruption in Indonesia? And I think that probably the only thing now, I think there's two things, actually. One is a bit funny and one is serious. The first one is death penalty for corruption. I think, like, I'm not advocating for that, but I think as soon as you make the death penalty for corruption, people will stop. I mean, like in China or in other countries, like I think if people are really afraid that that's a possible outcome, teaching to children from a very young age, and there needs to be an understanding of why corruption is bad. There needs to be a logical thought process, right? That starts from a very young age. And then hopefully when those children finish high school and then they go to university and then they get jobs, they'll carry those values. So it's a value shaping exercise actually in terms of power. Now, I know that there's been some attempts to do that, but I think so far they've failed. There was, I remember, kapan ya kasus Andi Malaranggeng sama ibu yang Miss Indonesia itu apa? I forgot. Lupa namanya. Siapa? Yes, Angelina Sanda. So at that time when that case was happening, there was already like, ini kan politisi muda, sudah terjangkau dalam korupsi. And there was a lot of like pessimism, and it's like, the system's failed, and we thought that the young people who were like protesting against Suharto in 1998 were going to be the new hope, and then it didn't really happen, right? So I think it's difficult, but the only real thing that can be done is to try and shape the values for the next generation. Actually, I think this generation is over. Like, there's no helping the current parliament and the current politicians, but maybe for the next one. And then as citizens, of course, like choosing politicians who are clean and who are committed, not somebody because you like their face or they're an artist or they're giving you money or whatever. Yeah, maybe for this audience that's not such a big issue, but to try and promote the idea that it's really important to choose politicians who are committed to anti-corruption because they're the ones who make the laws, they're the ones who put the budgets to enforcement. And yeah, if you look at the last like few years with the KPK, kan apa ya, the DPR has apa, melemahkan KPK. They've changed the incentive structures, they've changed the budget, they've changed the processes, they've now got like, I don't know, the police and pengadilan and the DPR are all involved in the KPK. It wasn't like that before when it was first started. It was really independent. So, yeah, that's my confused answer. But I think, you know, it's not going to happen quickly. And even like this last election from 2019 through 2014, it's worse, I think. The electoral campaign, money politics is getting worse, not better. Why? Okay. I forget what the question was. Aku lupa tadi pertanyaannya apa.
Overplay resistance.
Okay.
One of the most effort in
Yeah, that's itu susah juga. I think sudah. Do I have to go? Finish? Oh. It depends on the issue, right? Kalau untuk kaum disabilitas, menurut saya sudah ada cukup banyak kemajuan dalam kebijakan. Mungkin masih ada kelemahan dengan implementasi, tapi secara undang-undang sudah ada undang-undang disabilitas, sudah ada beberapa pemerintah daerah yang sudah ada regulasi terhadap disabilitas. There's more opportunities legally. I mean, they have a quota system for businesses now. Seharusnya ada, aku lupa ya, mungkin 2% karyawan yang penyandang disabilitas. I'm not sure if it's 2%, but there's some quota. 2% and 1%. So I think that's a good example of a marginalized community that has been very good at lobbying, but it's also not a great example because I think disability is not a very controversial issue. Like who's against helping with people with disabilities? Like that's not really part of the discourse, right? But if you think about other laws like undang-undang yang terkait dengan kekerasan terhadap perempuan, where there was a lot of lobbying, even though women are not a minority, right? Women are at least 50% of the population, but the lobbying was really strong, and they still didn't get everything that they wanted because the religious, in my opinion, the religious values and the patriarchal values that are associated with gender dynamics in Indonesia are too strong. And they could fight until they die, maybe, but you have to change the values first before you can change the law in a really strong way. So yeah, I don't know what the solution is. I think maybe mungkin ada orang Indonesia yang atau peneliti Indonesia yang punya ide yang lebih tepat untuk bagaimana bisa mencapai tujuan yang tujuan untuk minoritas atau apa. I don't know. Maybe Hanif has some ideas. Your area of expertise. There's so many. The ideologies that I talked about are political and policy, but ideologies like patriarchy, religious domination, they're probably, honestly, in Indonesia more of an influence than they are in, say, somewhere like Australia, where our society is not so concerned with religion. There's other issues, of course, but yeah, those are the kinds of values that I think need to be deconstructed a little bit. Like, it's fine to be if everybody is the same religion and everybody agrees that these are the religious rules, then that's fine. But Indonesia is like a multicultural society, so yeah, I think decision makers need to think about that. Yeah, sorry, I don't have any solutions, only questions.
We have question from students.
Okay.
The
The most
most
powerful.
She has power.
What kind of power? Manipulation?
Pakai bahasa Indonesia boleh kan?
Okay.
Oke. Tadi yang dijelaskan itu kan soal ideologi, cara kita memandang dunia dan gimana cara kita mengimplementasikan itu. Tapi di sini pertanyaan saya itu terkait gimana kalau ternyata cara kita memandang dunia itu diyakini sama komunitas dan kepercayaan itu mengeras, terus melukai orang lain yang seharusnya ideologi itu cara kita menciptakan kesejahteraan secara terstruktur, maka akhirnya struktur itu jadi struktur yang menindas karena ideologinya mengeras. Nah, gimana caranya untuk membuat ideologi itu tidak mengeras begitu?
Yeah, I think kalau dalam situasi itu mungkin kita bisa lihat konsep itu positive freedoms and negative freedoms, ya. Kalau positive freedoms itu ada undang-undang atau kebijakan yang jelas memperbolehkan aktivitas seperti apa atau perlakuan seperti apa. So the government can protect minorities by creating explicit laws that say people are allowed to do this. You can't hurt somebody if they're doing this. So, ya, kalau misalnya dengan agama, ya, mungkin itu contoh yang paling terlihat di Indonesia. If you have a community of people who are Islamic next to a community of people who are Christian, and like mungkin biasanya mereka tetangga, it's no problem. Tapi kalau ada hari raya Kristen, mereka ada they have songs, they have noise, there's lots of noise and it's very noisy. Sometimes people might complain, right? They're like, oh, it's so noisy, I don't like it. When they have their Christmas, it's so noisy, it's too much noise, I'm trying to sleep, I don't like it. So in a situation where there's positive freedom, that means that there's government regulations that say, yes, if this is a religious ceremony for you, you are allowed to do X, Y, Z. And it applies to all religions at the same time. Kalau orang agama Islam, agama Kristen, agama Katolik, Buddha, everyone has the same rules, everyone has the same positive freedoms, then we can be confident that nothing bad will happen to us if somebody is not happy with what we're doing. I mean, they can still complain, but they complain like to their friends. They're not complaining to the police. They're not complaining to, soldiers or anything. So I think with protecting minorities and looking at how the interactions are between communities, yang mungkin pandangan dunia itu agak berbeda. The government can step in by making sure that there are equal protections for all of the communities, regardless of the religion. Now, I think, again, Hanif has done some research on this with religions yang di luar agama yang resmi. Yeah. So if you have people from religions that are not resmi, orang yang mungkin agama yang tidak resmi di Indonesia, their rights are not protected in the same way as other religions. So the government could, I mean, I don't know if they would do this, but they could create laws to protect all religions, bukan hanya yang resmi aja. Semua agama punya kebebasan untuk melakukan ABT. So I think that's one way that the government could intervene in a positive way. I don't know if that's possible or not. I don't know. Enggak tahu ya kalau pemerintahnya memang punya ide untuk melakukan kebijakan seperti itu atau tidak, but that's one possibility.
Okay. Let me introduce myself. My name is Ulandari, and I will ask about. Actually, in my research, I have research, and this research about marriage in this country. I found that some part of religion was intervened by state. So the regulation, new regulation, was opposite by old regulation. And I want to ask your opinion. It is right to intervene religion and belief by regulation about legitimate marriage, because here in Indonesia, if you have different religion with your partner, your marriage is not legitimate. But before, it's legitimate, but a new regulation it make this different. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I have an opinion, but if we look at the ideologies, that's probably a better place to start. So if I'm a liberal, if I believe in liberalism, then I think that the state shouldn't regulate interpersonal or personal behavior, and that the state has no role in telling people who they can and can't marry. It's not about religion, it's about freedom of choice. If you are a fully functioning adult, ya, jelas bukan untuk anak-anak ya, kalau perkawinan di bawah umur, that's a different situation. But if you're an adult and you have the capacity to make decisions, then under liberalism, the government has no responsibility or role in telling you what you can and can't do. Now, if you're a conservative, then cara pandangannya beda ya. If you're a conservative, then you probably think, actually, society is crazy. People can't be trusted. People are going to make all kinds of mistakes. So the government needs to have rules to stop people from making mistakes, to stop people from making bad decisions. And in that sense, the concept is it's a bad decision to marry somebody who's from a different religion than you, right? So the state is regulating your decision because they think, I mean, in a paternalistic sense, we want to stop you from making a mistake. We want to stop you from doing the wrong thing because you might have, wrong ideas, or you might be salah, agak tersesat or whatever. So the government is like, don't worry, we're going to look after you. We're going to tell you, regulate who you can and can't marry, and that will be good for you, and that will be good for us. That's how, the conservative idea is within sort of state decision making. Now, obviously, ada orang yang konservatif, ada orang yang lebih liberal, and it will depend on your point of view. If you think that the government should make laws about who you can and can't marry. Personally, for me, I'm probably more of a liberal. I don't think that the government should tell me who I can have a relationship with or who I can't have a relationship with. But of course, I'm coming from Australia, where this is not really, we don't have any laws about marriage like this. you can get married to whoever you want, right? Like even in Australia now we have same-sex marriage. So if I want to marry a woman, I can marry a woman. If a man wants to marry a man, they can marry a man. The state's not having any rules about that, even though it's quite new. I think 2019, they made an equality equality in marriage law. So you can marry whoever you want, and it's a positive freedom, right? Because the state has said, we regulate that you can marry whoever you want. Now, of course, my values are shaped by my experience in Australia. So that's my opinion. If it works in Indonesia is not for me to decide. But yeah, I mean, I think we have to look at too, what are the, kalau undang-undang ini dampaknya untuk masyarakat seperti apa? Like it just makes things more difficult if you want to get married. And ya, aku juga punya teman yang satunya Kristen, satunya Muslim, and they fell in love, and it was very difficult to get married. Very, very difficult to get married. And yeah, I mean, I look at their experience and I think that seems unnecessary for them. But yeah, I mean, her family didn't agree. There's all kinds of social issues as well, right? Not just from the government, but also from society. Yeah, that's my opinion. Sudah? Oh no, okay, now.
Yeah, just one last round.
Okay, okay. I have to make my answers brief.
All right, thank you. In school in Indonesia, like the only ideology. One of the value of Pancasila is social justice. However, in reality, the school has not been fully achieved even now. Thus, implementing social justice require another ideology, for example, socialist or capitalist.
Yeah. Yeah. Jawab langsung. Atau gimana? Jawab langsung. Oke. Ya, itu tergantung definisinya social justice itu apa. Because I mean, social justice means different things to different people. So I think within like, okay, there's another aspect to ideology that maybe it's good to talk about. Ideology is just ideas or words. Ideology only has an impact when people take that ideology to justify certain actions. So when we're talking about, is this a good ideology, is this a bad ideology, does this ideology support ini atau ideologinya lebih sesuai dengan pikiran seperti ini, it's a very academic exercise, because when we look at reality, it can be different from ideology, right? The actions that people take might be justified by ideology, but they're individual actions. So if the question is, do we need a new ideology to support social justice? Personally, I don't think so. I think what is needed is a reinterpretation of the existing ideals of social justice. So social justice means different things to different people. And within the Pancasila ideology, which I am not an expert on Pancasila, so please don't quote me. This is just my, ideas off the cuff. But the implementation of Pancasila, and particularly social justice, is driven by the values and the interests of the people who are in charge. So, I mean, if you as citizens want better concepts of social justice, better applications of social justice, then probably what needs to change is who's in charge, not the ideology itself. Maaf ya kalau dalam bahasa Indonesia itu agak susah buat aku. I can't explain it in Indonesian so well. Tapi itu sudah jelas atau mungkin belum? Okay. Sudah? I'm still. Oh, okay.
Good afternoon, Dr. Elizabeth Kramer. I want to say thank you for the opportunity. You stated earlier about how policies were made by the powers, but is it possible for the less powerful one to decide or make policy for the more powerful ones, like minorities making a policy which will be used by both minorities and majorities? Thank you.
Okay. The short answer is no. In a formal political system, the decision makers are set by the hierarchy, right? So you have the president, you have the DPR, you have the ministers. In a formal political system, it's not possible for people who are not in positions of power to make decisions. But what they can do is influence decisions. So I think, it's so different in Australia to Indonesia. But let me give an example. So in Australia, I volunteer for an LSM. It's called Sydney Alliance. Aku dari kota Sydney. Sydney Alliance is the name of the LSM. And we're a grassroots organization, and we advocate for very specific policy changes that we think will help people who are minorities, people who are less vocal, all kinds of things. So every 2 years we have a vote within the grassroots organization, and we prioritize issues based on the vote. So if most people think, oh, we should focus on education, then we focus on education. It's supposed to be a democratic, supposed to be a democratic organization. And so when we choose an issue, so for example, in 2018, we decided that we wanted to focus on refugees, refugee rights in Australia. And there was an election in 2019. So we started by lobbying the political parties, but it was very simple lobbying, like sending letters, sending emails, requesting meetings, proposing policy solutions, and some politicians agreed to have a meeting, and some politicians ignored us, nggak balas suratnya atau emailnya, and eventually, we managed to get the Labour Party in Australia to change some of their policy platforms for the election, related to, this is rincian yang agak detail. Tapi we got them to increase the quota for refugee visa allocations as their policy platform for the next election. And we were so proud of ourselves. It was a big win for us. And then in the election, the Labour Party lost. They didn't win. They didn't win the election. So we lobbied for 6 months, and there was no success, no outcome. There was many, many hours of sending emails. So I think it really depends on, like, not just the lobbying, but also the political context as well. Because if Labour Party won the election, then we would have been successful. But they didn't win, so we weren't successful. So I think lobbying is very much about not just the efforts, but also the timing, the opportunities. If you can find champions, like, I know, well, there used to be some people in the DPR who were very strong against corruption, right? So every time there's like a kasus korupsi atau apa, they're like talking to the media, they're like bringing attention to the issue. And then if I'm an anti-corruption advocate, I can go to that politician and maybe we can help each other, or they can put certain laws or policies to the komisi apa, I forget now, komisi apa yang terkait dengan korupsi, komisi 3? Yeah. So it's about opportunity and timing as well. So I think, okay, the lesson from the failed experience is that I think it wasn't really a waste of time because we didn't know what was going to happen. So there's always something to be gained from trying, advocating, finding connections, finding networks, finding champions. The bigger your coalition is, the more attention you can get, the more access you can get. So I think it's easy to be pessimistic about advocacy for, especially for minority groups or for particular issues. But I mean, if you don't try, you don't know, right? So yeah. There's always something that can be done, I think, even if it's just small. Okay, I'll give you another example. Sorry, ini cerita dari pengalaman saya sendiri. So we lost the lobbying for the refugee visas. That was at the federal level. Jadi setelah itu kita ganti arah ke pemerintah lokal. And so we lobbied the local government to give free childcare access to refugees, and to at that time there was like a hibah untuk art apa dalam bahasa Indonesia, aku lupa. Kesenian, yeah, ada hibah untuk kesenian. And we lobbied the local government to create a special hibah untuk refugee, untuk orang pengungsi, so that they could express themselves and their trauma through art. And it's like not really as impactful as getting a visa. Like, of course, getting a visa is much, much more important, but it was a way for us to help within our power, and that was possible. And so the local government did give free childcare places to refugees, and they also had a special grant hibah untuk kesenian orang yang refugee di wilayah lokal itu. So yeah, I mean, if the national level is too far away or too hard or too difficult, you can always start at the local level, see what you can do. Maybe if you're interested, you can become an anggota DPRD yourself, make some changes. But yeah, does that, semoga itu apa ya, menjawab pertanyaan Anda.
Okay, thank you. Miss Deva Aditra. Uh, First of all, I want to say sorry because my English is very bad, and that's why I want to practice it.
Okay.
The question is, in our country, we use check and balances to reduce or control the power, but the system isn't working very well because of any reason, like political problem and conflict of interest, corruption, and any other. And I just want to know how about in Australia? Uh, in Australia, using the same system, and how about the implementation? Thank you.
Okay, of checks and balances. Okay. Pertama-tama, aku harus bilang sistem di Australia juga belum sempurna. Masih ada banyak kekurangan juga di sana. Tapi mungkin apa ya, nuansanya agak berbeda. So I think for Australia, yes, there are corruption cases. Yes, there are conflict of interest cases, but not like in Indonesia. It's, I think it would be very difficult to take money from the government because there's lots of checks and balances that you have to go through. Kan di sini ada kasus siapa yang menteri agrikultur? Ya, yang menggunakan uang menteri untuk apa ya? Like untuk pesta, untuk urusan keluarga, untuk apa ya? I think that would be very difficult in Australia because there's like accounting oversight and things like that. But conflict of interest is very possible. There's been many cases where we've had apa ya, politicians yang mungkin mereka punya banyak saham dalam satu perusahaan, terus membuat undang-undang yang apa ya, yang mendukung industri itu atau perusahaan itu. Kasus seperti itu pernah ada. The big case in Australia at the moment yang mungkin lagi di media tuh is to do with whistleblowing. Kalau di Indonesia ada whistleblowing ya. Dalam bahasa Indonesia apa? Oh, okay, sama. Whistleblowing. So ada kasus yang cukup terkenal di Australia sekarang. Ada salah satu orang yang dia dulu kerja di dia orang militer dan ada intelijensi di situ bahwa ada kasus pelanggaran HAM di Afghanistan yang dilakukan oleh tentara Australia. So he had the evidence, the report of this wrongdoing. Terus, I don't know, ada banyak hal-hal yang terjadi secara internal, tapi pada akhirnya dia mengambil keputusan untuk pergi ke media, untuk kasih laporan itu kepada media supaya media bisa melaporkan tentang kasus kesalahan ini di militer. Now, this was, they call it in Australia, sharing of state secrets. Then, because it was a state secret that he was sharing, he was not covered by the whistleblower law. So he's just been sentenced to, I think, 9 years in prison or something. But, I mean, I guess if the democracy was functioning properly, he would be protected because he's reporting wrongdoing. So, yeah, in Australia we have cases like this. But I think also one of the big differences between Australia and Indonesia is that we have much clearer separation between nasional, bagian negara, and lokal. So in Indonesia, when I look at the law, it's very messy. Like, ada undang-undang nasional, but untuk implementasinya harus ada apa ya, perda atau peraturan bupati atau apa. Like, there's no direct line from the national to the local about how laws are implemented. Whereas in Australia, the separation is very clear. Laws that are made at the federal level apply everywhere, no exception. Laws that are made at the state level apply in the state, no exception. And ada apa ya? There's a separation of topics. So in Australia, kalau untuk edukasi, pendidikan, kesehatan, itu semua di bawah bagian negara. The federal government will not regulate on education, and it won't regulate on health, except for universal health care. All of the hospitals are at the state level, all of the health programs are at the state level. So that's why when we had COVID in Australia, all of the different states had different policies. So if you were living in my state, in New South Wales, it was quite relaxed. We didn't have, like, lockdownnya cuma untuk 4 minggu, and then it was agak bebas. But in other states, the lockdown was for like months. In Melbourne, in Victoria, I think they were locked down for almost 6 months. And that's because their state government had a different policy to the New South Wales government. So, yeah, like, health things are regulated differently. So because there's only like one channel of decision making, I think it means that the opportunity for corruption is lower. The opportunity for implementation is higher because it's closer to the ground. Like, if you make a law, kalau di Indonesia kan begini, ada banyak undang-undang yang dibikin di Jakarta, tapi kalau turun ke desa ternyata nggak ada implementasinya. So, yeah, Australia is different. It's got different problems to Indonesia. Tapi pasti belum sempurna. It's definitely not perfect. And the other thing about Australia is jumlah penduduknya sangat kecil kalau dibandingkan dengan Indonesia. So we only have, I think, 28 million people. Indonesia berapa? 3. Ya. Kalau di Australia jumlah penduduknya cuma 28 juta orang. Sama dengan Jawa Timur ya. Okay, kalah dengan Jawa Timur. So there's less people, so it's a bit easier to regulate things, I think. When you more people means more complex. Sudah?
Thank you, Mbak Kramer. Ibu Kramer. I think our time is up. So
Yeah, I think I spoke for way too long. Whoa.
terima kasih, Bu. We will have lunch.
Okay, terima kasih. Thank you for listening.
So, see you.